In 1991, the Soviet Union, one of the world's largest and most powerful states, collapsed. The end of the USSR changed the global order forever, and the world was left questioning what had caused the fall of such an empire. In part 1 of this documentary, we explore the rise of the Soviet Union, its internal struggles, and the key events that led to its eventual dissolution. The Soviet Union was born out of revolution. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Russian Empire and brought the Communist Party to power, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's vision of a socialist state led to the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, in 1922. The USSR, under Lenin, set out to transform Russia into a global superpower, but the country was struggling to rebuild after the devastating World War I and the Russian Civil War. In 1924, Lenin died, and Joseph Stalin rose to power. Stalin's leadership took the Soviet Union down a totalitarian path, consolidating power with brutality. His policies, including forced collectivization, resulted in widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine. The Soviet economy, however, grew through industrialization. Stalin's Great Purge targeted perceived enemies, and millions of Soviet citizens were imprisoned or executed. Stalin's terror and repression left a scar on Soviet society. However, his legacy as a leader who helped transform the Soviet Union into a military and industrial superpower could not be denied, especially during World War II, where the USSR played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union faced internal changes, but tensions between East and West grew. The Cold War defined the next several decades as the USSR and the United States squared off as superpowers. Both sides engaged in an arms race, vying for global influence in Asia, Europe, and beyond. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, marking the height of Soviet and American hostility. Though the Soviet Union was a military powerhouse, it was also struggling economically. The command economy, where the government controlled all production and distribution, was inefficient. By the 1970s, economic stagnation set in. As production slowed, consumer goods were scarce, and many people began to distrust the system. The Soviet military, while large, was draining resources that could have been used to improve the standard of living. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the USSR struggled to maintain control over its many satellite states in Eastern Europe. Protests in places like Poland grew louder, as citizens demanded greater freedoms, and Soviet influence began to wane. And action. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms to save the failing system, notably glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or economic restructuring. Glasnost allowed for more freedom of speech, and perestroika aimed to restructure the failing economy. However, these reforms sparked greater discontent. While many citizens hoped for change, the reforms ultimately exposed the deep flaws of the Soviet system. As Gorbachev pushed for reforms, unrest began to spread throughout the Soviet Union. In Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 signaled the end of Soviet influence. The Warsaw Pact, a collection of Eastern European countries under Soviet control, began to crumble. The Baltic states, like Lithuania, declared independence, and protests erupted across the Soviet republics. Gorbachev, unable to suppress the growing wave of reform and revolution, was left with an impossible choice. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged from the ruins. The once mighty empire was no more. But what led to this stunning collapse? What was the final straw? In Part 2, we will explore the dramatic events of 1991 that brought about the end of the USSR, and the chaotic aftermath that followed.